Hi, I'm Brett Sankis. I am an M&A attorney, so mergers and acquisitions, and I'm also an M&A advisor. I do business brokerage and investment banking, and I help market and sell businesses. So very different from the law documentation side. We help sellers unlock value by finding buyers of their business. I want to talk today about comparing multiple offers. So let's hope you are super successful in selling your business. Let's hope I do my job really well. I always do. And we get you multiple offers, which is kind of hard in the Main Street part of the market. Businesses I call that less than $2 million because of the way businesses are marketed. But it's possible. We've got a business right now we're marketing where we've got 2 and hopefully a 3rd letter of intent coming in. And you just do it well and you've got a good business and you market it properly. That can happen at the market. And when you go up beyond Main Street into the upper middle market, the way businesses are marketed through a process, sometimes through an auction process, where they almost are always sold to competitors or private equity groups who want to be in the industry or are in the industry. It's more common to have multiple offers. But regardless, let's hope you come to me and I do a great job and your business is amazing, you're amazing, and we get you multiple offers. How do we compare those offers? So we've got letter of intent A, letter of intent B. And that's usually what we're signing, a non-binding indication of interest that this buyer is going to move forward and purchase your business. So there's a few major categories of things we're looking at to try and do some sort of apples and apples as best we can comparison of these offers. So the most obvious one, right, is purchase price. And if they're the exact same offer every way, which has never happened, but if it did, except that one's offering you $2.5 million and one's offering you $2.3 million, well, right, you know the one we're going to go with. That's easy enough. But purchase price is often more nuanced, and it's not as simple as just cash on the barrel, check at closing. It can come in different forms. And so sometimes it's deferred, and other times it can be contingent. So deferred means you're not getting it all right away. It's guaranteed, but you're not getting it all right away. So a common way that deferred income shows up is if the buyer asks you as the seller of a business to carry back a note, to hold some seller financing. So the buyer says, I'll pay you $2.5 million, but only $2 million is going to come in at the closing to you. The other $500,000 I'll pay you in 2 years, and I'll pay you 6% a year on that note. So I say that's guaranteed. I guess nothing's guaranteed till it's in your account. I guess you could have a problem collecting it, but generally that note's going to be secured against the business. It's a fairly decent, good risk from a lender standpoint. That's guaranteed money. You're just not getting it today. Sometimes you see, for various reasons, it's not a loan exactly, it's just we're going to pay you some today and we're going to pay you more in a year. I guess that's a form of loan, really, but sometimes it's pitched a little bit differently as just a deferral for one reason or another. But the point is, it's money you're going to get, should get, but it's not all today. That's deferred purchase price. Contingent purchase price is purchase price you're not even guaranteed to get. So the most common sort of contingent type of purchase price is an earnout. And I've got a video about earnouts, a deeper dive on them, but essentially it's the buyer saying to you as the seller, hey, I'll pay you some more money, but the business has to hit certain metrics. You have to stick around for a certain amount of time, or the business has to generate this much revenue, or just all sorts of different ways it can be fashioned that essentially says you're not guaranteed it. It's a way for a buyer and a seller to share some risk. And typically, if your business ought to sell, you think straight up it could sell for $2.5 million, and someone offers you $2.5 million, but another buyer says, well, I'll give you $1.5 million, but the rest of it's going to be contingent. You have a $2.5 million offer in hand, and one is 1.5 up front and then some contingent money. That contingent money better be, considerably more than $1 million, right? In other words, $2.5 million guaranteed cash today is much better than 1.5 million guaranteed, maybe another $1 million, right? So that earnout, you would hope you could make something like $2 million if things go well. In other words, for taking less today, for taking some of that risk, you're hoping for a larger upside. Those are broadly purchase price structure issues, deferral and contingency. Another way that purchase price sometimes comes in different forms. It might come in the form of consulting agreement or employment post-closing. And so that's really not technically purchase price, and it has different tax consequences. That's going to typically be taxed as ordinary income, not capital gains, if you agree to consult or be employed by the company after the closing. but you could still think of it as the seller of a business as still one part of one big pool of money you're going to get. Now, if the consulting fees or the employment, the salary is exactly what you should make for that type of work in the marketplace, then it's really not super attractive as purchase price, right? You're earning it over time. But again, you can kind of think of it as another way to get some money over time. And so that's purchase price, and this employment consulting piece brings us into the next big category of things that we'd be looking at to compare letter of intent A with letter of intent B, and that's what are you responsible for post-closing, right? How much do you have to give to the buyer? Do you have to stay employed for a certain amount of time? Do you have to give them training for 60 days at no pay? So you might want to just cash your check, or you receive a wire these days, you don't cash checks, but you can just take off. You're done, you want a break, and the question is, how much are you having to agree to give the new buyer after the closing? Now, you might want to work for the new buyer, that's fine, but sometimes we've got sellers who are really looking to cash out, retire, just recalibrate, figure out what they want to do next, and it's really important to them that they have as little post-closing obligations from a service standpoint as possible. There's another or two other things that show up in sort of post-closing obligations. One is indemnification. So, and this doesn't always find its way into a letter of intent. It's not always something we're weighing at the point of time of comparing offer A and offer B, but it often is. And that is, what is your exposure after the closing to things that show up that the buyer is faced with that are supposed to be things that are on your dime, or that things that you agree that you're responsible for. So this could be as simple as in many asset deals, the general idea is your watch, my watch. So if something shows up after the closing, but it relates to business you did before the closing or a mistake you made before the closing, something that really, it's showing up now, but it clearly relates to when the seller owned the business, that's something they may need to make good on. They may need to pick up and be responsible for. Or certain representations and warranties, which are statements of fact that a seller will make to a buyer. What is your responsibility if one of those turns out to not be correct? And we're not even talking about you just making something up or misrepresenting something. Like just the way these words are put on the paper and the sharing of risk, you may need to state something to a buyer that you're not 100% sure of. It's just like the buyer saying, look, but I'm not going to buy unless you take the responsibility for that, right? A good example of one is there are no unknown liabilities in this business. Well, how do I know if there's an unknown liability, right? That's what we'll say if I'm representing the sellers. I can only tell you what I can tell you, but a sophisticated buyer will come back and say, well, I don't care whether you really know or not. I just care that if something shows up and it's existed at that point in time, you just didn't know about it, well, that shouldn't be on me. These things, you won't be in the weeds on these issues at the point in time you're weighing offers, but you may be dealing with something called an indemnity cap. And the cap is a ceiling on the maximum amount of exposure, absent certain things like if you defraud a buyer, then there's just all bets are off and you can be responsible for anything. But normally you're trying to cap a seller's exposure to indemnity claims after the closing. And that cap may range from, on average, they're 10%, but that's taking into account big, large deals. In the Main Street part of the market, they're often a little bit higher than that. But we're trying to keep that cap to a point where it's like, no matter what happens after the closing, because you, the seller, won't have a business to pay out of, this is only coming out of what you earned on your one-time sale, that we know that you are going to take a certain amount of money away from the deal, right? And no matter what comes up, your total exposure is capped at X. And that's important. It's a really important term, and sometimes it shows up in an LOI, and it's something that we'll be really kind of thinking about and considering. A third post-closing obligation issue that almost always shows up in the LOI is a non-compete, and that is how many years and with what restrictions geographically or as far as the activity are you promising the buyer that you won't do. So in other words, the buyer of a business wants to know that you're not going to turn around tomorrow and immediately start competing, rebuild your business, and take their customers. So for how long are you needing to agree, in what geographic area, and in what scope of activity? Usually the scope of activity is exactly what the business usually does, but it can be more nuanced than that. So a non-compete may not be important to you at all if you're just looking to retire or to completely change industries. But if you think you might get back into this industry, you're just a little burned out, or you happen to be selling at a high point and just want to take chips off the table, it might be important to you to know when you can get back into the game. And non-competes in Texas in the markets where we operate, we see them at 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. That's pretty typical. They can range from nothing to 10 years. 10 years would be pretty hard to enforce for the court. And if you want to know more about non-competes, I've got a good video out there about those and whether or not they're enforceable, and we talk about it in the employment context and in the M&A context. So that's purchase price, that's post-closing obligations. The last major category of things we're considering when we're looking at offer A and B, we're into an M&A advisory and helping our sellers just decide who are we going with, is who is your buyer? What type of buyer are they? And 3 broad categories of buyers, not the only types, but 3 that you'll see often in the market are private equity or financial buyers. And these are companies that are really looking for a return. Everyone wants to make money, but they're much more driven by financial returns. They're less interested usually in just your industry generally, although they might have a bit of a focus from an investment standpoint in the industry, but they're not sort of what we call strategic operators. They're just looking for a return. And private equity is very common. You'll see them in the Main Street part of the market, you'll see them in the middle market, you'll see them all the way on up into public company deals. They're pools of other people's cash, and they're getting in, they're buying companies and turning around and growing them. And then competitors, right? That's a common type of buyer. And then individuals. Now, individuals, you don't see them much beyond Main Street, above about $2 million. They just don't tend to be buyers of $50 million companies. But individuals will buy $1 million companies. They've got a little money, they sold another business, they came into some inheritance, and they just want to buy into a business rather than start one. Buyers, these different buyers have very different hot buttons. They have very different, from your perspective as seller, pros and cons. They are just differently motivated. So a private equity buyer is very unlikely to get cold feet, right? An individual buyer who's never bought before might just think, oh my gosh, at the last minute, do I really want to do this? A private equity buyer, no, they do this. This is what they do. On the other hand, they've got a very rigorous process. They spend a lot of time in due diligence. They'll spend a lot of money on accountants and lawyers kicking tires, even on small deals. It's just how they run things. They value those services. They want to be they run a very consistent process, regardless of the size of the business. Competitors, they can be great because they understand your business. They have a need for the business, but at the same time, they can be very difficult on price. Private equity buyers, even though they're financially motivated, tend to, at least compared to competitors, like small business competitors especially, tend to be a little bit easier on price. They see a lot of value they can unlock. They have a greater plan. They might be rolling up an industry, buying lots of companies and trying to take it public. They tend to offer more, in my experience. Competitors tend to be a little bit tougher. Even though they're strategic and not financial, they can sometimes come at it with a very tight, jaundiced, I don't know if this is the right term, but eye on your business. Might be tough on it. An individual we already talked about is probably going to be easier on documentation and due diligence, but might get cold feet, might not understand what they're doing, might be difficult sometimes, especially if they get the wrong advisors, to even get over the finish line because they just don't get it. They don't understand risks that are acceptable and aren't. It's up to them, right? But sometimes a less sophisticated buyer can be more difficult, at least in my shoes, to deal with because they just don't understand what's typical, or they don't understand what we're talking about, right? It can be just challenging. So those are hard things for you. If you don't have advisors in your corner right now and you look at multiple offers, that might be a little bit challenging. You should call me, I'll help you out. But if you haven't gotten to that point, you want to make sure that the advisors you get are seasoned and they know their way around this, and they're going to really earn their money and show their value by helping you weigh those offers and those things that aren't as objective, right? You can look at your offers and say, well, it's $2.5 million, that's $2.3 million, that's that. But when it comes to buyers and their motivations and how likely you are to get to the finish line, because the goal is not to get the highest letter of intent, the goal is to close on the best possible terms for you. That's where your advisors will really earn their money. So there are other things to think about, but those are really 3 broad categories of things. And if you need any help on the legal side or on the M&A advisor side, reach out. I love this stuff. Would love to help you out, and consider me a resource. Thanks for listening today.